All right, so now we're going to have Ben Watkins cross-examine Father Gregory Pine, and again, Ben is more than welcome to interrupt Father Gregory to move the conversation along or to change topics altogether. Whenever you're ready, Ben, start, and I'll click the 12-minute timer.
So I just want to start off. So when I approach philosophy of religion from an analytic philosophy perspective, I start in the vein of Paul Mosier, in that I start with the concept of a being that is wholly worthy of our worship, meaning that it's always worthy of our worship. It's not contingently worthy of our worship. It always is demanding of our attention and reverence and respect. And so I think from that initial concept, the divine attributes follow. And so we end up with the attribute of perfect goodness. So this is the divine attribute that is driving the reasoning of the problem of evil. So on your view, since you deny that God is a moral agent in some sense, you deny it. But is there a sense on your view in which God is praiseworthy or blameworthy? If God does have acts, those acts have consequences for the world. Is he praiseworthy or blameworthy for those acts in such a way that he would always be worthy of our worship?
So I guess short answer is no, because to be morally praiseworthy or blameworthy entails that one is subject to a norm which transcends his nature. So St. Thomas has this argument when he talks about the possibility of will in the angelic intellect. And he says, picture a hand that it's etching, and let's say that hand, were the very standard of its etching, then that hand could not but etch well. So, to the question whether I ought to have etched this way or that, one would simply respond, I etched. And that's a sufficient justification. Whereas he says if it is subject to a higher standard, namely like a notion in the mind of the artisan of what good etching looks like, or a standard, kind of piece that he wants to replicate, then we can say that it more or less closely approximates the standard itself. But in the case of God, there is no law, as it were, higher than his nature. And here you kind of get into the Euthyphro problem, right? Which is, there's like a big scholarly literature on that, and certainly like a lot of exciting arguments to rehearse. But the basic idea is that God's nature is good, but in a way that it's not that it's anti-moral. It's more so like transmoral, in the sense that goodness has a prior metaphysical definition before it comes into the adjudication of moral claims. So it has a kind of ontic character in the notion of classical theism. And basically, like Aristotle and St. Thomas begin with the observation that we call those things good which we desire. So it's kind of phenomenological. It's the thing towards which one has an inclination by virtue of the fact that his nature is suited to it. And then, he introduces conversations surrounding like perfection. We call that thing perfect, which lacks nothing proper to its nature. And then final causality. It's the type of thing which accounts ultimately for the movement of a nature towards its full realization. So in the context of a conversation about God's goodness, what we're talking about is ultimate desirability. And a lot of times St. Thomas will kind of include in his arguments this idea that God is universally true and universally good insofar, we go back to the notion of ipsum esse per se subsistens. He just is being, right? He is in all of its various modes and modalities. He's wholly uncircumscribed. His very nature is to be esse. And so God is not circumscribed or limited by having his, form contracted to a particular actus essendi or to a particular kind of bundle of matter, but rather he subsists in the mode of perfect being. And so in that sense, we would say God to be good. So when St. Thomas advances his argument from question 2 in the Prima Pars, then he goes towards simplicity, which you gestured towards, that God is not complex, that DDS there, and then perfection, and then he builds up 2 questions there, 5 and 6, on God's goodness. And the kind of ultimate fruit of which is simply to say that God is, and that we are made for God. And so with respect to like, your consideration as to whether or not one is always worthy of our worship, for him, like the virtue of religion, which is a potential part of the virtue of justice, which governs this idea of worship, he thinks that it's available to us by reason. Mind you, it's complicated by original sin, but it's still something that we should realize is immediately attendant upon our natures having been given. So because God is creator and end, we owe him worship by virtue of the fact that he is our causal and primal source. But we need not fear that because there is no higher law by which to norm God, that he can subsequently like go off, willy-nilly, because that's to import, anthropomorphizing criteria into the adjudication of God's actions. God need not explain why he did this or that. He simply is. And for us, the kind of stance is not so one of putting him in the dock and accusing him of wrongs, but rather, like an atheistic tradition, is of adopting a contemplative stance and saying, like, what is the meaning of this? And by asking what is the meaning of this, one, lays the groundwork for having that unfold in his or her life as, he suffers God's timing and permission and comes to discover that this was all for the good. So like a kind of classic Augustinian thing is that God only permits evil to befall to draw forth from it some kind of good, like a textured good, a rich good, a beautiful good. And I've been talking for too long, so I'll stop.
It's all good. We're having fun. So this view seems quite reductionistic then when it comes to our moral concepts. It seems that goodness and morality are being reduced to God and God's actions. So what ought to be reduces in some sense to what is. So this is the famous is-ought gap from Hume. How can, it doesn't seem that we can fully cash out all of our normative concepts in non-normative terms. So is the is-ought gap something that worries your Thomist view? How do you, you know what I mean? Like, how do you respond to the is-ought gap is what I'm not trying to set up a gotcha question.
No, I got it. I'm laughing because I'm just like a swaggering punk kid Thomist, so I'm like, let's go.
Let's go.
So St. Thomas, he anticipated it, and it doesn't scandalize him, largely because, he's indebted to Aristotle for his basic groundwork. But sure. I think that for us, a lot of this kind of movement from is to ought, it comes connaturally. I don't think we're too terribly scandalized by it when it does arise in our moral reasoning. So like you take simple example of the fact of, I have teeth and my teeth are covered with enamel. I have 28 of them. I want to keep them free of cavities. I don't want to grind too much because then I'm going to have to get, work done later. And so I take care of them in a particular way, certainly inspired by the counsel of my dentist, who I'm actually going to see next Thursday. So I'm looking forward to that.
See mine on Wednesday. That's cool.
What's up? So I floss, I brush, I mouthwash, I, gargle, whatever that is, salt water for, oral hygiene's sake. Basically because I don't want to spend a lot of money down the line on, oral work. And I don't want to cost my province money because I'm already irresponsible when it comes to taking care of my body with like knee injuries and stuff like that. So I don't want to give them further cause to think I'm reckless. So I just went basically there from an is to an ought. Now, mind you, like different analytic philosophers have way by which to describe that as a kind of suppositional or hypothetical or conjectural or conditioned mode of argumentation. But I just basically said, like, I have teeth that I want to work, and so I ought to treat them in a certain way. And it kind of impinges upon me as a rule, right, as normative. And so I think that our life is just surrounded by these types of things, whether or not we acknowledge them. And it shouldn't be for us too terribly trying when we get to kind of higher order moral arguments. Mind you, they are more contentious and they're like more specific or particular determinations of the moral law. And so they're going to be more contentious by virtue of the fact that you've introduced like matter and contingency and all kinds of wild excitement. But going from an is to an ought is something that we do daily, and it doesn't cause us too terrible heartburn. So I think that like what we do is a kind of metaphysical morals with whether or not we acknowledge it. So to go from metaphysics to morality is something that's just in our DNA.
Awesome. So that's what I wanted to comment on the normative bit. So moving to views of free will for you. So how do you avoid the implication or potential implication, I should say, of determinism on your view? So I'm still relating to this the problem of evil. Sorry, I'm all over the place. With God sustaining the world in being. So God is sustaining the world in every moment through his his activity. But so isn't God sustaining the bad actions of individuals? So that seems to be, again, I'm not trying to set up a gotcha question, but how do you reconcile that tension there?
Sure. So this is a big, in the Augustinian kind of Thomistic tradition on this, the teaching is that evil is a privation of the good, a privatio boni. So asking the question, what is God doing with evil is a kind of category error, right? It's to point at something which is not. So now, mind you, evil can be very forceful, terrible, in an existential way, but we shouldn't accord to it the status of being. So when St. Thomas does his metaphysics of evil, he asks, about the four causes. So you've got the efficient cause, which is like the agent that brings it about. You've got the final cause, which is the purpose for which. You've got the formal cause, which makes the thing to be what it is. And you've got the material cause, which is the stuff out of which, or stuff in which, the form adheres. And when he asks about evil, he said, the material cause is the act itself because it adheres in the act, but that itself is good. And God sustains the act in being insofar as that act is, and that is a good thing. Then he asks with respect to the form, it's a privation. So it's what ought to be there and is not. It's a kind of disorder. So in the concrete instance of, sin within the theistic tradition, you have a variety of goods on offer, and you're choosing in and amongst or between them, and you affirm a lower good to the detriment of an affirmation of a higher good. So I'm toddling down the street, okay? On the left side of the street, there's, let's say, somebody trying to parallel park their car, and it's clear to me that, like, one of their mirrors is broken and that they're partially blind and that there's a high risk that they're going to run over a water main.
1 minute.
And, things are going to go terribly. And on the other side, there's a Chick-fil-A, and they have a sign outside that says free spicy chicken sandwiches, well done fries, and Chick-fil-A sauce. And I'm like hemming and hawing, like, what do I do? And I dart into Chick-fil-A. That's sinful because I affirmed a good, right? So I had as the object of my act something good. But in so doing, I subverted an inclination to what is in, a higher, more substantial good. So there, it's about affirming a good. That privation is about affirming a good, but one that's deficient by comparison to what ought to be there. The efficient cause is just the human being, and the final cause is a kind of madness, right? So the final cause is it's trained on this good, like Chick-fil-A, but it's to the detriment of the other thing. So with respect to God supporting evil and being, God is supporting agents and their acts, and he's giving them at always, at all times, at least the grace sufficient to turn to him, to make of it something beautiful and good. As to whether or not they choose to accede to that offer, to consent to and cooperate with it is another thing. But God, is positively, agentially initiating something that is good.
Okay.
Thank you for watching this clip. You can click here to watch the full episode. And I want to say a big thanks to our sponsors and to our amazing patrons for making all of this possible. Please do us a favor before you go. Click that subscribe button and then the bell. And that way YouTube will be forced to let you know every time we put out a new episode.